I'm Dane Rose. It is normal for both victim and perpetrator in an abuse dynamic to feel shame, rage, helpless, terrified, hatred, and profoundly lonely. And for anyone who understands the long cycle of intergenerational abuse, the answer is clear and obvious. The reason for this is clear. In order for an abuse dynamic to perpetuate in broad daylight in our cult, it requires deep commitment to chauvinism and with it ignorance to all feminine domains in the psyche, including the psyche as a whole, in the polarity between the masculine image and the outer world, and the feminine felt experience of the inner world. In a chauvinistic cult, we are committed to teaching hundreds of hours of algebra, trigonometry, and many other unrelated fields that we will never apply for a single day in our lives. While at the same time, one can go from cradle to grave in our cult without a single formal hour of traumatic training, of awareness of PTSD symptoms and response, of science-based feeling, to understand the science of the human heart and the implications of each feeling and how they are created, of effective de-escalations of violence between another human being, of how to heal shame, of how to respond to another person who's been sexually abused. You might think calling the police. Often the incompetence of and ignorance of those responding to many of the forms of psychological and physical abuse in our cult escalate the trauma in a cult that doesn't train its police force or the public on the felt experience of the trauma survivor. There is a pathological commitment to ignorance, which saw me reaching age 40, traveling around the world, living in multiple communities, including the Findhorn community in Scotland, doing over $140,000 of various what's called alternative, but one could say psychologically oriented healing, reading hundreds of books, studying philosophy and metaphysics. But by age 40, in this cult, I didn't know how to respond to a cutter in a culture that produces so much pain in its people that a number of people cut themselves. I didn't know how to recognize traumatic symptoms in a partner in a cult that produces so much trauma that I was unknowingly witnessing traumatic symptoms in 1/3 of my lovers and responding, as we all do in a traumatically illiterate culture, with ignorance and cruelty. I didn't understand the depth of chauvinism or how to respond to it in myself or in others. I did not understand the various ways that shame is deposited on our many isolated victims, or the coping mechanisms to defend against it. I didn't know that addiction, be it compulsive thinking, compulsive reliving of the past, compulsive busyness, or the 1 in 7 Americans that have a substance addiction. I didn't know that addiction is a symptom of profound chronic pain beyond the ability of the self-abuser to manage. I did not understand that when someone feels hate, they are communicating to themselves and anyone they have the courage to speak to that they find themselves in a place of profound hurt, profound helplessness, and feel betrayed because no one will help them out of that state. This will produce hate. Self-hate or other, it doesn't matter, every single time. And the answer is to give help, not judge them for being negative. I didn't know that 1 in 3 women are sexually molested before the age of 18. Nor did I understand the complex psychological and biological impact that this has on so many relationships, on so many women. I didn't know the difference between profound psychological cruelty and love. I didn't know what love was, and I didn't understand what it was to be an adult in a culture that never bothered to articulate what that meant either. It takes a profound, concerted ignorance to a level of deep cruelty to design a culture that can avoid competent relating skills, traumatic literacy, emotional literacy, definitions of love, an awareness of what it is to be an adult compared to the body being a grown-up, the difference between a feeling and an emotion, or competent community protocols for responding for the vast amounts of grief, shame, and violation that our culture produces. Now, all cult patterns are self-perpetuating, not by science, but by the use of dogma. So, chauvinism is self-perpetuating because you already know, as I do, that the feminine state, that the feminine realms, that the feminine domains of the psyche are so much less important than the masculine domains of the psyche, of the outer physical material world, that it doesn't seem like a crime. That you may not know the technical definition between a feeling and an emotion, or understand an effective response to a feeling, hate, that our cult produces all the time. It may seem just fine to simply label cutters as weird. it's normal. And it's cruel. One of the things I'd like to put out as a meme is that you deserve 100 hours of psychological literacy. As a start, as level 1 in becoming a human being, you deserve 100 hours of psychological literacy. And I'm not talking about hypes and have a positive attitude and different slogans that are thrown around to cover the absence of science. Science is the process of pattern recognition using large amounts of data. It's fine to have an opinion. Tell the person who's just lost the one person in this world, and in America there are many people who do not have a single competent friend. Loneliness is going up, and with it, suicides. There are many people that do not have a single competent friend. And it's fine to have your theories about when they should get over that grief. But I didn't learn the stages of grief or how to go through them in a chauvinistic culture either. 100 hours of science-based psychological literacy is a small step towards sanity in a cult that for many produces more fear. Fear connects to pain. If you have not experienced large amounts of pain, you do not have large amounts of fear. Fear is the anticipation of reliving a pain you've already experienced in the future. Fear is the anticipation of moving into the domain where you become the next scapegoat when you've watched the pain in your friend. The more underlying pain we witness and experience, the more terrified we are of a reality that creates it. Because what we are afraid of is being stuck in unmanageable amounts of pain in a cult that is incompetent to respond to it. I didn't know that love had layers. The child needs attachment. I need you. The adolescent, I want you. I want to fuck you. The young adult, it's all about me, exploring the world, opportunity, finding myself, the young adult. It's only the adult love that is actually looking outward. You have me, me, me. And the adult is born in the synergy that first looks inward and says, how can I love the many unloved parts of myself? How can I love that terrified child in the corner, carrying the shame of abusive giants? How can I be there for the shaking, trembling parts of myself that feel unspeakably unwanted? And having learned how to love the pain, the shame, how to heal, to make whole the various abuses of our cult, the adult is the first part of the psyche capable of looking outward and saying, how can I love you? And to love is not some vague, ephemeral thing. It is to reach out, to connect enough to care. It is caring enough to see. If you don't care enough to see someone, and this takes quality time, you don't love. You may wish them well, but you cannot love without seeing. caring enough to see. It is seeing enough to understand. It is understanding enough to empathize. And this is, by the way, a completely natural process. If you fully understand someone, which takes time, presence, and psychological literacy, you will empathize with them. It is understanding enough to empathize. And if you empathize enough, you will attune. Because empathy is the first acknowledgement that we are one, that your feelings and sensations are as valuable as my own. Now, if I'm sticking a nail into your skin at the point when I discover what that feels like to receive that barb, I'm going to attune. I'm going to adjust. I'm going to say, oh, I'm sorry. And I'm going to pull back the nail. And if I understand the wound that I've caused, I'm going to get some antiseptic. I'm going to give you a hug and say, can you forgive me for my cruelty, for my ignorance, for my stupidity, and for hurting you? And I get it now, and I'm sorry. How have I affected you? Can you still drive with a nail puncture? Do you need me to get you a taxi? Are there things you need to say? So that we can be attuned together. Not attuned in violation and pain, but attuned so as to succeed. Love involves success. At what? Every human being in the history of the planet has had a hierarchy of human needs. Needs, not preferences, not alternative whims or New Age fantasies, needs. Abraham Maslow was pivotal in illuminating the cross-cultural needs throughout time to survive. Every human needs to survive. So what does it mean to love someone if survival is in jeopardy? It means to behave in a way that increases their odds of survival. If they don't have a place to sleep, it means participating in seeing that they do. If they don't have any food, it means participating to see that they do. You cannot love someone, and even the most sociopathic definitions, and dissociate yourself from their needs. Survival, security, love and belonging. Every human being at level 3. Just level 3. We're not talking about the pinnacle of self-actualization, needs love and belonging. More than 70% of Americans feel regularly lonely, meaning they don't know how to love themselves and nobody else does either. That's what it takes to feel lonely. I'm in a place in the psyche that no one knows how to love, including me, so I feel lonely. They feel chronically lonely. What would you expect in a psychologically illiterate culture? No one's teaching us how to love. They're teaching us how to shame, violate, criticize, and abuse. Self-esteem. To love someone is to understand who they want to be as a person and understand their impediments to becoming that and participating with them in a way that helps them become the person they admire. It's earned self-love. I want to be honest, and I told a difficult truth today. I feel self-esteem. I want to be kind. I didn't hang up and shame the person that revealed one of my many mistakes. I want to be kind. Whatever it is, self-esteem. Every single human being that has survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem wants to become their best self, wants to discover their unique talents and gifts. And then upon discovering and developing those talents, wants to bring them out in the world and see positive impact. I want to matter. We need to matter. I want to have an impact. I want to see the thousands of hours I've spent learning the piano move you to tears. Bring life to your life. I want to see the baking that I've done and this and that bring a smile to your face as you eat it. I want to experience the abundance that comes when my gifts are out into the world. Every human being needs this. And to deny a human being the opportunity or even the psychological literacy to know what these needs are is an act of cruelty. It takes a willful amount of ignorance to live 60 years in a cult with nobody mentioning these things. And upon experiencing the abundance, because we are born to be reciprocal, the more we give out of our gifts into the world, the richer our culture, our community. This is why it is an act of self-love for a community to consciously nurture its members through these stages. You do not get someone giving their gifts to community when they don't have a place to sleep, when they can't talk about the incest in a cult that doesn't know how to respond, and they're stuck in trauma and regression. You don't have a contributing member to your community. Because we're too ignorant and too cruel to give those members to our community by consciously supporting an individual through these stages. We don't even measure them. How dumb do you have to be as a world government to understand this science of psychology and never once ask your citizens, where are you doing? Are you surviving? It's just an email away. A census is free. And we don't even track how many Americans are struggling with security. How many of them have never had a sense of love and belonging. How many of them have had, 2%? I felt loved this one afternoon for this brief moment before you hit me, before you left me for that other person, and I've never really felt it since. The level of mediocrity and cruelty that we inflict on ourselves with this willful ignorance is stunning. And the individual creates the cult creates the individual. The cycle of ignorance can be interrupted at each point on the circle. In a psychologically illiterate cult, it would be sheer hubris to expect me to do anything other than a very crude and imperfect attempt. But here is what I'm attempting with this project. I'm attempting to, number one, because this is very important in the case of professional abuse and negligence, to reduce the amount of danger that the next victim is in this case with the Human Awareness Institute, which was the primary offender. Increase the safety of the next victim. Gary Slutkin did some groundbreaking research as a leading epidemiologist. He discovered that violence follows the pattern of an epidemic. The best way to predict where the next outbreak of violence will be is where the last one was. And the best way in this emotional life, a PBS series, they accidentally, because in a chauvinistic culture, you study emotions accidentally. It would be too intelligent to actually say that a third of the human experience is feelings. We know very little about them. We don't teach our children anything, so let's get to work. So they accidentally studied the viral nature of emotions in a town for several decades. And lo and behold, all emotions are viral. Violence is viral, fear is viral, pain is viral, trauma is viral. The priority of an intelligent cult is to prevent the next outbreak of the disease. When pain, shame, trauma, and abuse are treated like a disease in which the offender is contagious, which means that at one point the offender caught the disease from someone else. When abuse patterns are treated as a virus rather than as a moral punishment platform, you have the best results. Now, it is inevitable, and you have to be incredibly obtuse, which many of us, of course, are, no fault of our own, just the way that we are brought up in ignorance. You have to be incredibly obtuse to expect someone going through a shame, violation, diminishment, insanity, and burial ritual in our cult. Because that's what we do as a shadow-averse cult. First, we abuse someone. Then we ask them to call that abuse love. We cause pain, then we ask them to go insane, and then we cover it over. And we hurriedly move on as if nothing happened. And the person is left to wonder why they suddenly want to drink so much, why they feel so much rage and violence. And then we have a barrage of defenses ready about when and how they should move on, how they should be positive, how they should not listen to the barometer of their own heart. The heart is a barometer. It tells you what's going on in the environment. Anyone who was this ignorant in physical terms could just open a barometer and move it to sunny weather. Wouldn't it be great? And that's what we tell our abuse survivors to do. Break open the instrument of the human heart and move the needle. And just feel good and grateful that you were sexually molested by your father, that your mother covered it up, that the police humiliated you in front of your siblings and school, that no one in your culture knew what they were doing, and that everyone made you feel worse and alone. And now they're doing it again, telling you to feel good about this. Just break open the thermometer and pull the temperature up to 65 degrees because we don't want to deal with the reality that it's sub-zero temperature and we're dying. So this brings me to the second attempt with this project. It is profoundly cruel and unworkable to regularly subject, at any given point it's usually a minority, but to regularly subject a percentage of our population to this degree of traumatic abuse and cruelty, and then hand them out on a platter to the ignorance, shaming, stupidity, cruelty, and chauvinism of their family, of their culture, and often their therapist, and expect them in a shocked, painful, and regressed place to educate the incompetent on how to be with them and love them, when the incompetent are so arrogant in their chauvinism that they ask for a 1,000-hour lesson that we should all have been given in school, to be given coherently by a traumatized victim, and then say, "Up, I've got to go." It is a joke to hand the scapegoating cruelty of our cult to often the most vulnerable members in the cult, because they're the ones that'll take the abuse. Children, the poor, women, the elderly, the marginalized. These are usually the people we pick as our scapegoats, the homeless. To ask them to be more intelligent than we are as a cult and explain to us why we're making them feel worse and how we are hating ourselves by doing nothing about the contagion that ripples out through our community is a laughable proposition. I've been there, in which I left my country because I could not find a single competent American. I'm not saying there aren't some. I couldn't find a single competent American who did not escalate the shame, the abuse, the crazy-making frustration in one way or another. Which also means I couldn't find an American who was willing to learn. Fred Burks, in one of the side projects around the Circle of Silence around this, says, "I can give you 30 minutes. It's like, Fred, you're a little bit too dense to educate in 30 minutes about all of the many ways that you've hurt me, and it's an insult to yourself, the culture, and the community to expect you to go from ground zero in pathological ignorance to a point where you could actually use 30 minutes to do something good rather than to make it worse, which you do again and again." A chauvinist doesn't have time to learn anything. And so it takes time, and it should take time. We will not let our pilots fly in a 747 until they've had 6 years of consistent simulations and trainings that show they know what they're doing. We let dysfunctional, addicted parents in intergenerational abuse systems control the innocence and beauty, the profound possibility field of a human psyche in the form of a helpless child. That's the gap in chauvinism. In a cult that values money more than the people who make the money, the fact that the plane costs hundreds of millions of dollars would, of course, dictate that you'd spend 6 years to get it right. The fact that the human psyche took 15 billion years to perfect and has an infinite possibility field. We don't even require 100 hours of mandatory parenting training. And we get what we pay for in the areas we're cheap, which is in the feminine terrain. And unlike the popular version of feminism where men are all the problem, the feminine self in each man is as brutalized as the females in our cult, often by females. A boy's education about the diminishment of his feminine self is often led by his mother. The mother teaches the feminine self in the boy that he's worthless and that the only thing that matters is the world out there, that feelings are for sissies. The boy externalizes this message to treat the feminine women in his life with the same barbaric cruelty. and everyone suffers. Everyone suffers when the feminine is dishonored. And a man capable of honoring and loving his feminine self does not dishonor the femininity in women. When you understand abuse patterns are viral, the question is, who is abusing the feminine side in all these men to such a degree that it is primarily men who physically externalize that wound towards women? Where are men learning that who they are as human beings is so worthless that it's not worth honoring in another? So the second aspect of this project, first is prevent more abuse. Second is to take some of the burden so that when you meet your next cutter, when you meet your next addict, when you meet someone who is violently, emotionally abusing themselves as a learned adaptive coping strategy to avoid the helplessness of not being able to stop the abuse in infancy, that you actually have the toolkit, at least a few hammers and chisels, to respond with competence. And this is a 100-hour project, which admittedly, in a cult that says that your work, making money, is your most important thing, and we pray with our time, not with our stated ideals. If you're spending 10 hours a day preparing for work, commuting to work, and working, you're saying that's the single most important thing in your world, which is exactly what our cult tells us. So within the framework of ongoing chauvinism, in which people are reduced to money-making machines, 30 minutes a day is probably doable. I learned that Audible is a powerful tool. When you've got trauma, for one, you can't read clearly. I couldn't read books, but I could listen to Audible and listen some more. 2, 3, 4 hours a day, and start to become psychologically literate. It's not too expensive. If you buy 20 books or more, they're only $9.95 per one per credit. I have a 500 book library. Thank heavens, there are dribs and drabs of great information out there that can be piped right to our ears as we're walking and taking hot tubs and bathing and having massages and whatever it is that we're doing. We can be learning the data that honors the feminine terrain, so that someone in a shocked, shamed, and incoherent state is not left with the impossible burden of teaching you how you're making it worse because you didn't bother to know, because you don't know how to love, because this cult does not teach love. It teaches shame, silence, pretense, and being cool. Being cool, by the way, is a symptom of emotional incompetence. The empathic-sociopathic continuum is metaphorically communicated on a temperature spectrum. Frozen is sociopathic. In the reptilian brain, no feeling. Empathic is very warm and liquid. Transcendence, you heat the metal of the psyche to the point of its melting. At a moment of transcendence, the metal within the psyche, the metal within the identity, the structure melts. And when it cools down back into just empathy as opposed to transcendence, you can have a new view of the world, a new identity. It's one of the reasons psychedelics can be transcendent experiences, is they participate in the liquefying of consciousness and the release of consciousness into regions endogenous in the brain, where you discover a more beautiful, at best, if constructively done, a more beautiful version of who you are. And once the steel cools down, it will not move from that new image with the same rigidity, as steel doesn't like to change its shape when we are. Now, what happened in infancy is we come in hot in infancy and very malleable. We're violated in various ways, and that becomes our template. We can't change the template. The steel is too hard. And it takes a transcendent experience of a high temperature to some degree before we can reliquefy that steel and come back to a new shape. This is feminine technology, and so naturally none of us know anything about it. The other thing I want to do, and am practicing with this work, is to explore the ways a single victim, zero support in the United States, zero. No one wants to deal with this terrain. How can a single victim in a violated and harmed state speak up for the community? Because this is the chauvinistic misperception. When the victim speaks out, they are speaking for the community. They are bringing a virus to light that didn't just come from the person. Viruses travel, and they will keep doing harm as they migrate. Every perpetrator was once a victim who didn't get help. I'm a victim. If I don't figure out how to help myself or get help, I will become a perpetrator. Now, the fact that we don't know that is just one more symptom of chauvinism. The data bears this out. An epidemiological study would conclusively show it's not the same. Diseases mutate. So I might be deeply hurt and feel valueless. And whereas my professional Peter Sandhill sexually abused me under the influence of psychedelics, I may not take that route. I may just be left feeling worthless and terrify other people in some other way. Because it's the emotional virus that spreads, but it first has to alter and stay stuck in the body in some way. So when you do not competently support the people contracting the diseases of trauma, shame, loneliness, cruelty, chauvinistic ignorance, violation, they will feel helpless because you do not help. Or if you help by making it worse, they will feel even more helpless. And this will metastasize in the body, and sooner or later, another member of the community will be a recipient. Or they'll kill themselves. And then you lose a valuable member of the community. So these are the goals. And it would be incredibly arrogant to expect me to do a good job with the little that we give each other. We have the blind leading the blind. But this is a beginning. I started a nonprofit, Happiness Data, in part to explore templates for resolving these issues that work. Not that sound good, but that work. Because sadly, the New Age, with all of its focus on shaming those who have negative feelings, and it's not my problem, I'm going to focus on what's good in my life, and leave someone with a contagious disease, just ensures that there will be 5 more victims within a brief matter of time, often the most vulnerable. the diseases that we do not love and contain spread. The only person capable in the psychological terrain to love and heal is an adult. And as Robert Bly points out in The Sibling Society, we do not create adults. I've rarely met adults in this country. As a child, I was surrounded by giant grown-ups, and I did not have a single adult to turn to that prioritized the desperate traumas of a child, the desperate loneliness of a feminine self, ahead of the sociopathic power needs of the grown-ups around them. And this is how we raise little boys to become sociopathic monsters such as Donald Trump. It's not his fault. He just didn't meet a single adult who prioritized the needs of his feminine self as a little boy. And it's very possible that your child will go through this life without meeting a single adult capable of honoring the feminine self in his life. So as you go forward, pick a dose. Pick a dose. This is tough work. I'm going to ask you to see your cruelty, your ignorance, your parents' ignorance. And I'm not going to do it with the beauty and grace of a culture that's been teaching these things for hundreds of years. I'm going to do it with the clumsiness of a shame-based, deeply hurt and enraged victim of profound sociopathic violence again and again and again, peering through the studies and the literature. Studying this, I studied it 1,000 hours. And I've been talking about it for 1,000 more. Because when you understand the data, you will realize, as most of the most intelligent, competent members of the psychological community realize, that trauma in a traumatically illiterate cult costs the economy trillions of dollars, reduces human life, and diminishes the quality of life for everyone in that state by more than 70%. It's that big of a deal. And one has to be incredibly committed to an ignorant cruelty and self-hatred to deny the 100 hours it takes to become at least aware of how much we don't know that we don't know. That's a good start, because now you've broken through the arrogance of chauvinism and you have humility for our incompetence as a cult to care for feminine terrain in ourselves and those we love.